Good morning, church. The February Birth Club members will present information this month to highlight the importance of Black history and history at St. Matthew Baptist Church. The information will begin with food for thought. Thought on our past and why Black lives matter. The 400-year-old life cycle and history of Africans and African Americans are replaying itself before our very eyes. Think about the current political climate, racial divide, the hate, the spread of misinformation, conspiracy theories, and oppression of ethnic groups. There's not enough time to reference everything, but hopefully this snapshot of events will spark your interest to learn more. So in February 1926, Mr. Carter G. Woodson, an African American, developed and launched the first Negro History Week. Mr. Woodson was dedicated to the idea that the treatments, values, countless contributions, and determination of Africans and African Americans to, by, and for this country should be taught and celebrated by all. His idea was well received, but not officially accepted until 50 years later, when President Gerald Ford signed a decree to establish Black History Month. From our early beginnings until now, the fight for freedom, justice, and equality continues. Now listen to these timelines and the lapse of time for change in our struggle for equality. It is recorded that the first indentured Africans arrived in the colonies known as America around 1525. Around August 1619, slaves arrived in Charleston and would provide free labor to landowners. Farming techniques in planting and harvesting crops was not a skill mastered by whites. The crops, mainly rice and cotton, were grown on the continent of Africa. The skills of the imported slaves allowed landowners and plantation owners to become very wealthy. Enslaved Africans were used, abused, and treated less than humans, but kept their strong faith, their spirit, worship, and belief that God had not forsaken them. Many escaped, many fought, and planned revolts, but in too many instances were killed because they were outnumbered by whites with guns and other resources. But they never stopped fighting. According to the Times Library, in 1704, the first formal slave patrol, known as police officers, was created in the Carolina colonies to manage and control slaves. In 1739, the Stonewall Revolt in Stonewall, South Carolina, was one of the earliest slave revolts. Research indicated there were approximately 250 rebellions against slavery documented in Congress. In 1740, the Negro Act was passed. This act made it illegal for enslaved Africans to move abroad, assemble in groups, raise food, earn money, and learn to read and write. Owners were even allowed to kill rebellious slaves if they thought it was necessary. The act stayed in effect until 1865, but again, attempts for freedom kept coming. In 1808, so many slaves were brought to the United States that Congress banned the import of any more. In 1831 to 1861, approximately 75,000 slaves escaped to the North by way of the Underground Railroad with the help of that bad sister, Harriet Tubman, and other abolitionists. Stacey Abrams is the modern-day Harriet Tubman. In 1850, Congress passed another law, the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed the government to participate in capturing escaped slaves. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected 16th President of the United States. This election was filled with many troublesome issues, such as our 2020 election of President Joseph Biden was. President Lincoln was faced with the succession of southern states, the relationship between the federal government, early debates over tariffs, unrest in states and territories, slavery, and abolition. There was little to no common ground for the southern states who vowed to secede from the Union and become the Confederate States if slavery was abolished. South Carolina was the first of the 11 states to secede in December of 1860. The uncompromising debate was the catalyst in 1861, which started the Civil War, a war between citizens of the same country. On January 31st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation to abolish slavery, especially in southern states, and allowed Africans and African Americans in rebellious territories to forever be free. After 4 years of conflict between the North and the South, major Confederate armies surrendered in April 1865. By the way, the Confederate States were defeated, yet as of today, many want to be honored for their cause. Does this sound familiar? In 1865, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. The Reconstruction era began. It was the government's attempt to redress inequities of slavery in its political, social, and economic legacy, and to solve the problems arising from the readmission of the 11 Confederate states that had succeeded. However, the era proved to be short. In late 1865, Mississippi and South Carolina enacted the first Black codes, which severely limited Black movements and accomplishment. And yet, the fight continued. 1868, Congress ratified the 14th Amendment, which defined citizenship. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, giving African Americans the right to vote. 1877 ended the Reconstruction era shortly after the presidential election of Rutherford B. Hayes, who made a deal to have federal troops removed from the South. In 1881, Tennessee, the home of the Ku Klux Klan, passed the Jim Crow segregation laws, and over the next 15 years, other Southern states would follow. This law prevented African Americans from commingling with whites and attending white establishments. Let's jump forward. Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921. It was a mob of white residents burning homes and businesses of Black residents living in the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This Black community was a thriving business district and referred to as the Black Wall Street. The rioting was a result of a white woman accusing Dick Rowland, a Black youth, of abusing her in an elevator. The youth was arrested. However, the initial information was interpreted by a white mob as an assault on a white woman, and they wanted the Black youth to pay. As Black residents went to the courthouse to help protect the accused youth, chaos broke out. Black residents were outnumbered by riotous mobs, leaving hundreds killed. The 36-block community burnt, looted, and many left homeless. The court decided a day later that it was more likely an accident that Rowland stepped on the woman's foot and ran out of fear for his life. Dick Rowland was released from jail the next day, left the area, and never returned. Black Wall Street was in ruins. In 1923, Rosewood Massacre was another thriving, predominantly African American community in Florida. It was too destroyed by fire and violence of large groups of white aggressors who searched wildly for a black man said to have injured a white store owner. Residents were permanently driven out. In 1954, the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education struck down segregation as it was deemed unconstitutional. In 1955, the Montgomery boycott, fueled by the refusal of an African American woman known as Rosa Parks to give up her seat on the bus for a white man. Her case could be interpreted as, "I am tired of being sick and tired from this injustice." In 1957, Reverend Martin Luther King and others organized the Southern Christian Leadership Committee, which became the leading proponent of civil rights movement. They encountered many acts of hatred, violence, and some death. In 1960, civil rights sit-ins by African Americans and other supporters took place in North Carolina and South Carolina with the purpose of being served at all white public establishments. The participants suffered violence, name-calling, and other despicable acts because they were unwelcomed. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act to stop discrimination of any kind to anyone. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, which outlawed earlier practice in southern states to disenfranchise and prevent African Americans from voting. 1968, civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King, who preached nonviolence and practiced it in each march of protest, was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He was silenced forever with a single bullet. Yet we fight on. In 2013, Black Lives Matter movement began and became a social media platform for Black-centered political will and movement building after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in 2012 for the shooting death of 13-year-old Trayvon Martin. The movement brought attention to the senseless killings of Blacks such as Walter Scott, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, many others, and most recently, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the list goes on. The movement has spearheaded demonstrations worldwide, protesting police brutality and systematic racism that overwhelmingly affects the Black communities. If you remember that as recent as June 2015, a young white male named Dylan Roof shot and killed 9 innocent people during a Bible study at Emmanuel AME Church. When captured, police officers treated him much like their son. Dylan said he was hungry, so they took him to Burger King. Imagine that. I'll stop here, but hope you've heard enough to understand why there are ongoing movements for Black communities and marginalized people for freedom, justice, equality, and understand that Black lives hadn't mattered for years to some. When someone asks, why should only Black lives matter? Educate them on the treatment of Africans and African Americans over the last 400 plus years by claiming today it is time Black lives matter. In 2021, we are still fighting the same fight, but with different fighters. Hatred is still alive and well by those who feel America belongs to a certain group who feels responsible for making America great again. That African Americans and other ethnic groups are not deserving of the same rights, liberties, and pursuit of happiness as they enjoy. The similarities of then and now are too real to ignore. As we fight on, let us try to be positive change makers. Remember, God is not dead, nor is he sleeping. That no matter what, he is always in charge and in control. So seek his peace and his guidance in your life so that we too can help make this world a better place. Thank you for listening.